On September 26, 2008, Paul Newman passed away, and Robert Redford lost the brother he had chosen. At the private funeral, Redford sat silently in the back row. When everyone left, he walked to the casket, stood still for 10 minutes, and whispered 4 words. "Thanks for the ride." This is the untold story. Hollywood, 1968. A city powered by ambition and doubt, where studios trusted numbers more than intuition and feared anything that didn't fit a proven formula. Westerns were dying. Audiences were tired of lonely cowboys riding into sunsets. And when the script for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid circulated through town, most executives read it and shook their heads. Too strange. Too risky. A Western that was funny, tender, tragic? To Hollywood, it wasn't a project. It was a gamble. But one man was willing to gamble, Paul Newman. A superstar at the peak of his power. Blue eyes that softened women and intimidated men. Cool hand Luke, Hud, the hustler. Newman didn't need this film. The film needed him. Robert Redford was the opposite. 32 years old. Hungry. And proven, still fighting to be seen. He had talent, but no defining role. No guarantee. When he heard about the project, he looked at it the way a climber looks at his first mountain. Beautiful, terrifying, and possibly unreachable. They met in a small Los Angeles restaurant. On any other day, it was ordinary. Tired waiters, sunlight broken into shards through dusty windows, the smell of bitter coffee. But on this day, history slid quietly into the corner booth. Paul arrived first. He always arrived first. He sat straight, composed, wearing the alertness of a man who had spent his life reading others with the precision of a detective. When Redford walked in, Paul lifted his eyes and instantly saw the tension Redford tried so hard to hide beneath an easy stride. Paul ordered coffee. Redford nodded. "I'll have the same." He didn't drink coffee, but he swallowed the tension instead. Paul noticed. He didn't mock it. He enjoyed it, the way a seasoned horseman enjoys watching a young stallion test the ground before running. Paul flipped open the script. No small talk. He didn't waste breath. "Can you ride?" Redford answered, steady. "I grew up in California. I can stay on a horse without falling." A small smile from Paul. "Can you shoot?" "I'm learning." Paul looked up. His eyes were sharp, but not cruel. "Here's the real one. Can you keep up with me?" That question wasn't about horsemanship, or skill, or comedy timing. It was about psychology. Can you withstand me? Stand next to me? Share the frame with me without disappearing? Redford met his gaze. For the first time since he entered the room, the nervousness vanished. "Try me." The energy in the room shifted. Silence deepened. Paul closed the script. He studied Redford not as an actor, but as a man, measuring drive, instinct, quiet fire. Paul extended his hand. "Then let's make a Western." The handshake was quick, ordinary, unnoticed by the other diners. But if someone had stood close enough, they would have seen something. The hands held a fraction longer than necessary, as if each man recognized something essential in the other. Something familiar, something sturdy. When Redford walked out of the restaurant that day, he wasn't just walking away with the role of Sundance. He was walking towards something he didn't yet understand. An older brother, a rival worthy of respect, a man who would challenge him, lift him, and stand beside him through the hardest fractures of his life. And Paul left with a single thought. This wasn't casting. It was 2 men discovering truth in each other before they ever saw fame. Years later, when journalists romanticized their partnership, when magazines called them the legendary duo, Redford said in a quiet interview, "We weren't paired up. We chose each other." And that choice became the foundation for 40 extraordinary years. Years no scriptwriter could have written more beautifully. The set of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid didn't look like a place where history would happen. It was dusty, chaotic, loud, the usual noise of filmmaking. Cables snaking across the ground, crews shouting instructions, the smell of horses drifting in the wind. But somewhere amid the dust and deadlines, something rare began taking shape. Not a scene, not a performance, a friendship. From the first day of shooting, Paul Newman and Robert Redford fell into a rhythm that felt almost rehearsed, though it wasn't. Paul's confidence met Redford's quiet intensity like 2 notes that somehow formed a perfect chord. They didn't match each other, they complemented each other. Paul brought looseness. Redford brought control. Paul cracked jokes between takes. Redford studied the script with a seriousness that made the crew think he barely breathed. And yet, when the camera rolled, their energies collided into something neither man had planned. They made each other better, funnier, braver, bolder. It was as if the presence of the other unlocked a part of themselves they didn't know they had. George Roy Hill, the director, watched them and knew instantly. I am witnessing something I can't direct. Because what appeared on camera wasn't acting. It was two men slowly, almost reluctantly, letting their guards down. There is a moment in the early weeks. Paul improvises a line, playful and unexpected. Usually, unexpected improvisation rattled young actors. But Redford didn't flinch. He shot back with a line of his own, dry, sharp, deadly funny. Paul burst into laughter, and the crew looked around, startled. Something had shifted. From that moment, the scenes seemed to breathe. The pauses felt alive. The humor felt natural. The danger felt shared. Then came the cliff scene. 100 feet of rock. A river below that no one could fully see. On paper, it was simple. Butch pushes Sundance to jump. Sundance confesses he can't swim. They leap anyway. But on set, the symbolism was unmistakable. They rehearsed the jump together, standing at the edge of the platform. Paul tapped Redford's arm lightly, the way an older brother might. Ready? Redford exhaled, eyes fixed forward. As I'll ever be. The director yelled action, and they leapt. Not as actors, not as characters, but as two men choosing, in a strange, wordless way, to trust each other. Later, Paul joked about it, called Redford crazy, said he jumped too soon, too fast. Redford shot back that Paul talked too much before the jump. But beneath the teasing was something deeper. These two men had crossed an invisible line together. And once crossed, it can never be undone. When filming wrapped, the crew knew they had witnessed more than a movie. They had watched two men become brothers. But the world wasn't prepared for what would happen next. When the film premiered in 1969, it didn't just succeed, it detonated. Audiences fell in love with the charm, the humor, the warmth between Butch and Sundance. Magazines clamored for photo shoots, press junkets, the duo branding. But Paul and Redford refused to package the friendship. They declined most paired interviews. They avoided joint publicity stunts. They did not turn their bond into a product, because what they had was not for sale. Instead, their friendship lived in the small spaces of life. At lunch between takes, where Paul would steal food from Redford's plate without asking. At late-night poker games, where Redford pretended not to care about losing while Paul gloated just enough to be annoying. In the quiet car rides back to the hotel, where the conversation dropped its performance and moved toward family, fear, ambition, and the cost of fame. In jokes so private the crew couldn't decode them. In arguments that ended not with apologies, but with long silences, silences that slowly softened into understanding. Their bond wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't built on declarations or promises. It grew the way real friendships do, in the spaces no one pays attention to. By the time Butch Cassidy became a global phenomenon, their connection had grown roots even they didn't fully understand. When reporters asked Paul about Redford, he shrugged it off. He's all right, he'd say, hiding a grin. When asked about Paul, Redford answered similarly. He's fine, I guess. It was a dance. A performance of indifference masking a loyalty as deep as blood. Years later, crew members from the film would say the same thing. You could feel it. They trusted each other, even when they didn't say it. Friendship, especially in Hollywood, often burns fast and dies faster. Fame distorts. Egos collide. Success creates distances that affection can't bridge. But something about Paul and Redford refused to fracture. Their friendship didn't depend on films, roles, or contracts. If they never worked again, they would still be in each other's lives. What began on set, dusty and accidental, became something sacred precisely because they never talked about it. They never labeled it, never explained it. They just lived it. And that silence, steady, unforced, unadvertised, became the foundation of a bond that would follow them for 40 years, through triumphs, failures, aging, illness, and ultimately, loss. Because the strongest friendships aren't the ones you shout about. They are the ones you simply keep. When The Sting began production in 1973, it didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like a continuation of a conversation that had never really stopped. Paul Newman and Robert Redford stepped onto the set as if they had only paused Butch Cassidy for a moment. as if the years between the films were just a breath. The chemistry returned instantly, electric, mischievous, unteachable. Studios saw dollar signs. Publicists saw a brand. Executives pushed for the title Butch and Sundance too. But the two men refused. They weren't revisiting characters. They were revisiting each other. And the film, slick, stylish, astonishingly confident, became a classic. Not because of its plot, but because of the unspoken language between its stars. The glances, the timing, the ease. A friendship that had matured into something quietly formidable. Yet while Hollywood begged for more, Paul and Redford stepped back from the spotlight, not from acting, but from the idea that they should forever be packaged as a pair. They worked separately, lived separately, built lives anchored in different worlds. But they never drifted apart. As the years unfolded, Paul Newman transformed. The rebellious charisma of his youth softened into wisdom. Fame no longer interested him. Purpose did. He founded Newman's Own, a small experiment that became a philanthropic empire. Millions of dollars flowed to charity, quietly, consistently. Paul rarely spoke about it. He didn't need to. Generosity, for him, was a kind of oxygen. Redford's evolution took a different shape. Where Paul gave, Redford built. In the mountains of Utah, he crafted something Hollywood didn't believe in, a sanctuary for independent filmmaking. Sundance wasn't just a festival. It was a rebellion, a challenge to the studios that had once dismissed him, a place where new voices could be born without permission. People called him the godfather of indie cinema. But to Paul, he was still the kid who pretended to drink coffee in 1968. Their lives diverged, yet somehow, impossibly, they kept intersecting. There were late-night phone calls, the kind that lasted for hours. Conversations about films that mattered, about mistakes they regretted, about aging, the body's betrayals, the strangeness of longevity in an industry built on youth. Paul teased Redford relentlessly. "You're too pretty for your own good." Redford shot back. Says the man who sells salad dressing with his face on the bottle. The humor was armor, but also affection. Behind every joke was a truth. Both men depended on the other in ways neither articulated. They appeared together at film festivals, greeting each other with that unmistakable, lopsided grin that said more than words ever could. When Paul walked into a Sundance event, the room seemed to shift. Redford always noticed. When Redford premiered a film, Paul watched with the quiet pride of an older brother. But they were not mirror images. Their differences deepened with time. Paul sought a smaller life, family, philanthropy, racing cars, escaping the noise of Hollywood. Redford sought a bigger platform, artistic freedom, a place to nurture young filmmakers, a role in reshaping American cinema. Still, like two rivers flowing through separate valleys, they ran in the same direction. There is a moment, rarely mentioned, from a festival evening in the 1990s. Paul had delivered a speech about the future of philanthropy, measured, thoughtful, full of humor. As he stepped off stage, Redford leaned over and whispered, "You make the rest of us look useless, you know that?" Paul chuckled. "That's the point, kid." Later that night, they sat together outdoors, watching the mountains fade into darkness. Redford would remember that Paul said very little. He simply exhaled, as if grateful that the world had become quiet long enough for him to enjoy a moment with someone who understood him without explanation. Their lives continued like that. Two separate trajectories, bonded by a thread that time could stretch but never break. People assumed they saw each other constantly. They didn't. They didn't need to. What they shared didn't depend on proximity. It depended on recognition. A look across a crowded room. A phone call that began with silence before the conversation started. A joke delivered exactly when it was needed. Advice that cut through the noise. They were not perfect men, both knew that. But they made each other better, and that, in the end, was the quiet architecture of their connection. 40 years. A lifetime of work, change, evolution. Two careers that reshaped different corners of the world. Two lives that grew in separate directions. And yet, like constellations, their positions only made sense when seen together. Because some friendships don't need to be constant to be permanent. They endure not through presence, but through the unspoken knowledge that somewhere, out there, is the one person who knows the unedited version of who you are. And for Paul and Redford, that was enough. The decline began quietly. There was no announcement, no dramatic moment, Just the subtle way Paul Newman seemed smaller when he walked into a room in 2006. A slight stoop. A cough he tried to laugh away. Eyes that still glowed, but carried something unspoken deep inside. When the diagnosis finally came, lung cancer, it landed with the cold, blunt weight of reality. Paul called Redford to meet him in Connecticut for lunch. No urgency in his voice. No hint of what was coming. Just a simple, "If you're free, kid, come by." Connecticut was warm that afternoon, the kind of soft summer heat that made the world seem harmless. But inside Paul's kitchen, the air felt heavy. Paul sat at the table already, hands folded, a glass of water untouched beside him. Redford knew immediately. He didn't sit down at first. He stood behind the chair, watching Paul, waiting for him to speak. But when Paul finally looked up, the silence said more than the words that followed. "It's cancer," Paul said softly. Not dramatic, not broken, accepting. "How long?" Redford asked. "They don't know. Could be months, could be years." For a moment, neither man breathed. Redford swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on Paul's thin shoulders, the fragility he had never seen before. But he pushed the fear away. Paul didn't need fear. He needed certainty. Redford finally moved, sat beside him, reached across the table, and took his hand. "We'll beat this." Paul smiled, not hopeful, not defeated, just grateful for the instinct behind the words. "We'll try." The months that followed were a slow unraveling of a body that had once seemed invincible. Paul's face sharpened, his frame thinned, his voice softened. But his mind, sharp, mischievous, stubborn, refused to fade. He continued to work, continued to give, continued to laugh when he could. But the illness was stealing time in small, cruel increments. Redford flew out whenever he could, each visit tinged with an unspoken fear. What if this is the last time? Yet neither man addressed the shadow creeping closer. They talked about movies, racing, family, old mistakes, old victories, the familiar ground that had always bound them. They avoided the future. It felt too fragile to touch. In August 2008, Redford visited again. This time, the change was striking. Paul's face had hollowed. The vibrant color had drained from his skin. His clothes hung loosely on a body, shrinking faster than anyone wanted to admit. But the moment Redford stepped through the doorway, something happened. Paul's eyes, those legendary blue flames, lit up with unmistakable warmth. "There's my Sundance," Paul said, voice thin but steady. Redford moved quickly to his side. "And here's your Butch." They sat together for hours, the late summer light shifting across the room as the conversation drifted from memory to memory. Every so often, Paul closed his eyes, not from pain, but from exhaustion. Redford watched him carefully, studying every breath as if memorizing it. At one point Paul whispered, "I'm sorry, kid. I'm not much company these days." Redford shook his head. "You're exactly what you've always been. Trouble." Paul laughed, a soft, fragile rustle of breath, but it was real. And for a moment, the illness loosened its grip enough to let them feel like themselves again. As the visit stretched into evening, Redford felt something tightening inside him. A tension he couldn't name. The room grew dimmer, and the shadows lengthened on the walls. Paul leaned back against his pillows, suddenly looking impossibly tired. Redford knew he should leave. Paul needed rest. But he couldn't stand up. His legs refused. His throat tightened. How do you leave a room when you know the world outside won't be the same once you step through the door? Paul sensed it. He always did. "Go on, kid," he murmured. "Get out of here before I put you to work." Redford tried to smile, but his eyes stung. He stood slowly, one hand resting on the bed frame, as if grounding himself. He opened his mouth to say something. Anything, but nothing came out. Goodbye felt impossible. Final. Wrong. So he didn't say it. He simply took Paul's hand one last time, held it, squeezed gently. Paul squeezed back. "I'll see you soon," Redford said. Paul's response was immediate, soft, certain. "I'm counting on it." Redford walked down the hallway with the stiff, mechanical steps of a man fighting his own instincts. Each footfall felt heavier than the last. At the doorway, he turned, hoping Paul had fallen asleep, hoping the moment hadn't hurt as much as it felt. But Paul was watching him, and he smiled. That was the last image Redford would ever carry of him. Thin, pale, exhausted, but somehow brighter than ever. Redford stepped outside into the warm August air. The sky was fading to gold, the world carrying on as if nothing had changed. He took one deep breath, then another, trying to steady the ache rising in his chest. He didn't know it then. He couldn't have known. But the steps he took away from that house were the last steps he would ever take with Paul Newman still living in the world. And sometimes, the cruelest part of life is that you only recognize the final moments long after they've passed. Because love, real love, deep friendship, doesn't say goodbye. It lingers. It waits. It holds on. The phone rang early on the morning of September 26, 2008. Redford knew before he answered. There are calls that belong to ordinary life. Missed meetings, casual updates. And then there are calls that break the world in half. Calls where the silence before the voice feels heavier than the voice itself. He picked up. "Bob, it's Joanne." Her tone was steady, but underneath it flowed something vast and drowning. "Paul passed this morning. Peacefully. At home." For a long moment, Redford said nothing. He simply lowered the phone, let it rest against his chest, and closed his eyes. The room around him seemed to tilt, as if gravity itself had changed direction. He sat down in his study chair and didn't move. Minutes bled into hours. Light shifted across the walls. Sybil walked in once, then again, finally understanding this was not a moment to interrupt. Redford remained still, hands motionless in his lap. A man carved out of grief. The funeral was held in a small white church in Connecticut, the kind of place Paul would have chosen. Quiet, modest, untouched by spectacle. No media, no crowds. Just family, a handful of old friends, and the weight of a legacy that had always been larger than the man himself. Redford arrived early. He wore a dark suit, a black tie, and sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. People whispered that he looked older, 10 years older than the last time they'd seen him. Grief does that. It moves fast. It steals color from the face and posture from the spine. He greeted no one beyond a polite nod. He accepted hugs without returning them. He kept his voice low, clipped, distant, as though every word cost something. When the doors opened, he didn't walk to the front row, though he could have. He could have sat with the family. He could have sat beside Joanne. Instead, he slipped quietly to the very back pew. He wasn't hiding. He simply refused to perform his grief for an audience. He wanted to disappear inside it. The service began softly, without fanfare. Paul's eldest daughter walked to the podium first. Her voice trembled as she spoke about her father, his dry humor, his stubbornness, his generosity that sometimes embarrassed the family because he gave too much. People laughed, then cried, then laughed again. Joanne followed. She held herself with remarkable dignity, hands folded, eyes shining. She spoke not about the actor the world adored, but about the husband she had loved, his quiet mornings, his fierce loyalty, the way he still left notes on the kitchen counter after 30 years of marriage. Friends came next. They told stories about Paul's pranks on set, about his terrible luck at poker, about the way he would show up unannounced at charity events simply to help carry boxes. Each story created a wave of emotion that washed through the church. Redford didn't move. Not once. He sat perfectly still, elbows on his knees, fingers intertwined tightly. A marble statue carved from loss. Then the lights dimmed. A screen lowered. They played a montage of Paul's films, Cool Hand Luke, The Hustler, The Verdict. And then, inevitably, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The final freeze frame filled the church. Butch and Sundance, side by side, running into certain death. Guns blazing. Together. Always together. Redford's hands shot forward, gripping the pew in front of him. His knuckles turned white. His breath hitched once, sharply, almost violently, before he steadied himself. Because that image wasn't a scene. It was a memory. A truth. A prophecy fulfilled. When the film ended, people rose slowly. One by one they approached the casket, touching it, whispering final words, placing flowers. The family stood nearby, accepting condolences through soft tears. Redford stayed seated. He waited. He watched the church empty out row by row. He watched Paul's daughters step outside. He watched Joanne leave, supported gently by friends. He watched the priest close his Bible and move aside. Soon, only two people remained, Robert Redford and Nell Newman, quietly rearranging flowers near the altar, refusing to leave her father alone. At last, Redford stood. His legs felt heavy, as though he were wading into deep water. The walk to the casket felt impossibly long. When he reached it, he placed both hands on the polished wood. His fingers trembled once, then stilled. He leaned forward, closed his eyes, and let the silence fill every space inside him. 10 minutes passed. Nell kept her distance, glancing at him occasionally, sensing something sacred in the moment. He wasn't breaking. He wasn't collapsing. He was communing with the man who had shaped 40 years of his life. Finally, he leaned closer. His forehead nearly touched the wood, and in a voice so soft Nell almost didn't hear it, he whispered 4 words. "Thanks for the ride." Nell gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears spilled freely, because she understood. Those 4 words were a lifetime. They were gratitude, farewell, love, and brotherhood distilled to their purest form. Redford straightened, took a long breath, and laid one final hand flat on the casket. A blessing, a goodbye, a promise. He turned to leave. Nell stepped toward him, face wet. He paused beside her. "He was the best man I ever knew," Redford said quietly. Nell nodded, voice breaking. "He felt the same about you. He talked about you all the time. About Sundance. About the ride you two had." Redford's mouth curved into a sad, fragile smile. It was quite a ride. He walked out of the church, the cool Connecticut air brushing his face. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He drove himself to the airport, boarded a flight to Utah, and returned to Sundance. The place born from a character Paul helped immortalize, the place that had grown alongside their friendship. As the plane descended, Redford looked out the window at the mountains, golden in the late afternoon sun. He felt hollow, but not empty. Broken, but not lost. He had just said goodbye to his Butch. And yet somewhere in the quiet of his heart, he knew. Some friendships don't end. They echo. They light the path forward. They become the voice that whispers. Keep going. Make good choices. Be the man he believed you were. And Redford, tired, grieving, but forever changed, carried that voice home. When Redford returned to Utah that evening, Sundance was strangely quiet. The festival offices were closed, the valley already wrapped in a blue dusk that softened the mountains and dimmed the world into something gentle, almost protective. He stepped into his home, the door clicking softly behind him, and stood there for a long moment, listening to the stillness. Sybil approached him carefully, carrying a mug of coffee, even though she knew he wouldn't drink more than a sip. It wasn't the coffee that mattered. It was the ritual, the offer, the familiarity of something warm in a cold moment. "How was it?" she asked. Redford looked past her, toward the hallway that led to his study. "Quiet," he said. "Paul would have liked that. There was no need for more." Sybil simply nodded and placed the mug on the counter. She knew that tonight, he needed solitude more than comfort. In the study, Redford turned on a single lamp. The glow was soft, almost golden, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to exhale. There, on the desk, he'd already laid out what the staff would only discover the next morning. A photograph. Not a publicity still. Not a staged behind-the-scenes shot. But a candid moment from the Butch Cassidy set. Paul leaning back in laughter, Redford mid-joke, both men young, unaware that the next 4 decades would bind them in ways no script could predict. Beside it lay a worn copy of the Butch Cassidy script, its corners softened from age. And tucked inside, a note written in Redford's unmistakable handwriting. "To my Butch, thanks for 40 years. Thanks for the laughs. Thanks for showing me what friendship is. I'll see you down the trail. Your Sundance." He read it once, then again, and each time, the words felt heavier, as if their meaning deepened with every breath he took. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, soft, steady, like someone pacing gently just beyond the house. Redford closed his eyes and let the sound settle over him. The next morning, before dawn, he called the directors of the Sundance Institute. His voice was steady, but something in it had changed, something quieter, resolved. "I want to start an award," he said, "for artists who reflect the values Paul believed in. Integrity, courage, generosity." There was silence on the line, a silence of recognition, not confusion. They already knew what he was asking. They could hear Paul Newman in the space between Redford's words. "We'll call it the Paul Newman Award," he continued, "and the first one will be given next year." In the weeks that followed, Redford withdrew from the public eye. Interview requests poured in. He declined them all. Television hosts wanted him to speak about Paul, to share touching stories, to let the world consume his grief one headline at a time. He refused. My friendship with Paul was private, he told his publicist. And it stays private. But privacy doesn't mean silence. Not entirely. In December 2008, he wrote an essay, rare, heartfelt, raw. It appeared in a major magazine and spread quickly across the world. People didn't read it because of fame. They read it because it spoke a truth most humans know but rarely put into words. He wrote, Paul Newman was my brother. Not by blood, but by choice. We chose each other. We chose trust. We chose to make each other better. He wrote, when you spend 40 years with someone, their voice lives inside you. Their values shape your decisions. And their absence leaves a hole nothing can fill. And finally, if, when I die, someone says I was half the man Paul Newman was, that will be enough. People around the world cried reading it. Not because the words were poetic, but because they were true. Time moved on, as it always does, though Redford didn't move with it at the same pace. Those close to him noticed the shift, the dimmer light in his eyes, the quieter smiles, the pauses that lingered a heartbeat longer than before. He wasn't broken. He wasn't fading. He was carrying something heavy, something he didn't want to set down. But grief does not always hollow a person. Sometimes it sculpts them. And in Redford's case, it softened something inside him. In 2013, when the first Paul Newman Award was presented at Sundance, Redford stood on a wooden stage beneath bright festival lights. The crowd hushed, not for the award, but for the man giving it. Redford held the trophy in both hands. He inhaled slowly, and he began to speak, not of the actor the world adored, but of the man he had loved. Paul believed in second chances, he said. He believed people were better than their mistakes. He believed art should lift others up, not push them down. He paused. The silence was deep, warm, reverent. This award, he continued, is for the ones who carry Paul's spirit, for the ones who use their work to make the world gentler. The audience rose to their feet. The applause was not explosive. It was steady, emotional, grateful. Redford smiled for the first time in a long time. It wasn't a showman's smile. It was a memory resurfacing. Later that night, a young filmmaker approached him. Mr. Redford, what was Paul Newman really like? Redford didn't rush the answer. He looked at the floor, then at the lights overhead, as though searching for the right shape of the truth. Generous, he said. Funny. Honest. And once he was your friend, he never walked away. The filmmaker nodded. Do you miss him? Redford let out a breath that trembled just slightly. Every day, he said. But I'm grateful. Most people go through life never knowing real friendship. I had 40 years of it. That's a gift. He paused, then added softly. That was the ride Paul gave me. Because that is what remains when everything else ends. Not the films, not the fame, not the applause, but the presence of a single person who walked beside you long enough to shape the person you became. A friendship that becomes memory, a memory that becomes guidance, a guidance that becomes love. And love, real love, does not disappear. It continues the only way it knows how, by lighting the path forward.